All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Before we get into the book, we got to talk about the Epstein files, supposed release, which is an actual release, and we got to talk about hypergamy in relation to what Carol Quigley's talking about in the book in relation to the Epstein files as well. So, first of all, it seems that Alex Jones definitely jumped the gun when announcing that more Epstein files were released. That is not entirely true, even though this AI here seems to think that, yes, the Department of Justice announced that it has released all the files related to Jeffrey Epstein. Right. This release was confirmed on February 15th, 2026. And included a list of over 300 names mentioned in the files. Okay, so that's basically what happened yesterday, was this confirmation letter, which the confirmation letter is actually a bad thing because it's basically saying that no more Epstein files will be released, right? We can see here on Wikipedia, it says that it says the DOJ stated that the January 30th release would be the final one and that it had met all its legal obligations. Right? So all that letter was with the 500 names or something, or 600 names of people. That's basically the DOJ's confirmation letter that they have sent all of the necessary files and that no more files are going to be released. And basically everyone that's in the files or named in the files still stands that there's no, actionable legal information in there that can lead to the arrest of any of these other people. And, I know people want to get excited over it and hopefully people will be punished, but it just doesn't seem like that's going to happen. Because, I've always joked about that, where it's kind of funny because, people think that they can ban you from the workplace because you smoke trees, right? Because it's easy to test for, right? You could smoke trees once a month and still fail a drug test, right? And I've been joking about this for years, but you can't test for pedophilia. You could go home every night and do a pedophilic act and show up for work the next day and keep your job and have your high-paying, high-powered job and go home at night and do pedophilic acts every night, and no one can test for it. You can't test for pedophilia. So that's how these people are getting away with it. Because what are you going to do? It's like some super powerful rich guy versus like a girl that was 15 at the time when it happened, and now she's like 35, and they're like, well, do you really remember? Do you really remember? Or were you just mixing up this guy's face that you saw on TV with some guy that kind of looked like him? Right? That's how it's gonna go. These people have high-powered lawyers. Like, these people get away with crimes when they're like on videotape doing the crime because they're lawyers. So the fact of something happening like 25 years ago to a 15-year-old girl, 14-year-old girl that's now claiming what happened, even though it seems that at least on a basic level, you can call it grooming, but they went there voluntarily. And look, I'm not saying that it wasn't wrong and what Epstein did was horrible, but it seems like a lot of the stories are exaggerated and a lot of the stuff is like unpunishable because of the fact that you can't test someone for doing a pedophilic act, right? You just can't. You can test them for weed though. You test them for weed and fire them and make sure they can't get a job anywhere in the country. They're like, oh, we'll make weed legal, but then we'll make sure that you can't get a job. But you could be a pedophile all day. You can go home and smack your wife, do some pedophile stuff to your stepdaughter, and then show up at work at your high-paying job the next day. And what are they going to do? Give you a piss test for doing it? You see what I'm saying? It's so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. Okay, so now we're going to get into the hypergamy part where what Carol Quigley's talking about in the book. Now, you can see the effect of this in the Black community already, and now it's becoming more widespread in just the general community of the world, basically. The epidemic of fatherlessness, right? And when Carol Quigley's talking about the whole like Electra complex thing that goes on within the household, where the mother and daughter are competing for the father's affection, that is only a hypothetical competition, right? Because most biological, well, I would say all biological fathers are not thinking about having sex with their daughters, right? So it's a completely hypothetical competition between the mother and the daughter in a household where the father is present. But the fact of the matter is that when there's no father present, the Electra competition becomes real because now this girl, the young daughter, is of age and she's directly competing with her own mother for the resources of men in their community. So it's no longer becomes a hypothetical situation where the mother is just trying to push the daughter out of the house because she feels threatened by the relationship that the daughter has with the father. In a hypothetical sense, now it's a real sense where guys from the neighborhood, rich guys in the neighborhood, drug dealers and pimps and gang members and the few rich businessmen that are in the community, the mother and daughter are now directly and real in reality competing for these men's attention, right? And so you can see how the mother has even more incentive in a fatherless situation to push the daughter out and to cause her to mature more rapidly, right? So look, I'm not saying that what Epstein did was right or what Epstein did, but you have to look at the situation from a holistic standpoint of how these girls got into the situation in the first place where they're being groomed, right? And we can see here, many of Jeffrey Epstein's victims came from fatherless homes, as it was reported that he and Ghislaine Maxwell targeted vulnerable girls, often from struggling families. And we know that, women that are single moms are more likely to be poor or have less access. And plus, they just don't have the father influence there, right? They just don't have that male protective type of mentality in the house. And then plus, you've got the whole Electra complex female competition going on between the mother and the daughter. So the mother's going to push her out of the house early, try to make her sexually mature faster so that she could get her out, right? So because she's in a direct competition now because there's no father in the home, so the single mother is also trying to get resources from men in the community. I already said that. So we can see that, in 1994, the $300 that people are claiming that he was paying for the massages or whatever is worth about $656 today. So back then in 94, like in a regular town, like not New York City, but like in a small town or something like that, that was like a month's worth of rent, or a lot of other things that you could get in the 90s for $300, which is like about $600 now, which isn't really a small sum of money, especially for a teenager, or a younger person. So we can see that there is some hypergamous effect going on with the Epstein files that has to do with fatherless homes or fatherless girls and the way that society's just structured now, where we're supposed to worship rich people because like you're saying in the book, that we went from a society where people were valued by their basically like character traits that were contributing to the community, like being a charitable person, a person that cared about their community, a person that showed up to work on time and did their job to the best of their ability and took care of their responsibilities and their family, to now just being rich in and of itself is a value. It's a moral value. So someone being rich means that they're a good person, and someone being poor means that they're a bad person. right? That's what it means in our society right now. This is the moral system that we live under, that being rich means that you're good and being poor means that you're bad. So you can see how these young girls would have voluntarily went to Epstein Island. And now I'm not saying that it's a good thing. I'm not saying that, oh, yeah, well, then Epstein's cool. And that means everything Epstein did is he's blameless. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that the society itself is what's making these girls vulnerable to this because of the increased hypergamization of women. Like, why are these girls not interested in boys in their grade? Why are they not interested in boys in their school, even a few grades above them, or even like a college guy, right? Like, you can imagine, like a 16 or 17-year-old girl getting with a freshman in college, right? Or something like that, because he has more money. But nowadays, that's not how it works, right? You go to college and you end up actually more broke, more in debt, right? And men aren't even going to college like that anymore. And so you can see how the hypergamy that's being, I guess, projected onto these women from society as a social value, that being rich means you're a good person, right? So you can see how, like, the stuff that MGTOW talks about the over hypergamization, like, we get it, women are looking for security and what protection and stuff like that. But when, one, they overvalue their own looks, because these girls obviously thought that they could be Victoria's Secret models too, or something like that, which obviously wasn't the case for most of them. And two, the fact that the moral value of the society is now that being rich means you're a good person, being poor means you're a bad person, that would attract these girls to go to somebody like Epstein because he's rich. Not because he's a good person, morally good person, but the morals doesn't even make sense anymore. He's just rich. That's all that matters. Being rich means you're a good person, right? Because we're basing it off of the old system where having a lot of money meant that you were doing a service to the community. Like, that's what most people assume. You have a lot of money, that means that you're serving the community. That means that you're fixing a problem that everybody has. But nowadays, it's not like that with fractional reserve banking and all this other stuff that we see going on, that you can be extremely wealthy and have done basically nothing of any like service to the greater population, especially someone that rich. You would think they would have provided a service for the entire planet or something like that. But no, all they're doing is being rich and attracting women, vulnerable women at some times, due primarily to the fact that they're just rich, and that's hypergamy, right? Women no longer care about your character traits, right? So, all right, now that we've got through that, and look, again, I'm not saying that what Epstein did wasn't wrong. I'm just saying that when you're looking at why these girls were going there, quote unquote, voluntarily, which I think that's a large part of the problem as to why they can't really charge anybody with anything, is because, one, the age of consent is different in different places. He had a private island. And two, that the girls went there at least on a basic voluntary level. Like, they weren't like kidnapped, like tied up and thrown in trunks. Now, maybe some people were, but it doesn't seem like they have any evidence for that, right? It just doesn't seem like they have the evidence for that. Because if they do, and they're not doing anything, that's insane. That's insane. If they actually have the evidence of the like most horrific stuff that people are implying has happened, and they're not doing anything about it, like, these people need to be like literally like torched, like, seriously. But, going with the generally accepted story that basically these girls were groomed by a rich guy and used as like party favors. And look, I'm not diminishing what he did, but I think what's more important is the connections and all this other stuff where he's like basically manipulating global events. And some people are saying, oh, that didn't happen either. That's a conspiracy. Bro, look at the emails. Like, he's got like world leaders and stuff calling him up, like, hey, man, can we get a meeting? He's got like the guy that owns Victoria's Secret, like telling him what to do or working with him and all these other people. It's, if you're saying there's no conspiracy beyond the like grooming of girls, it's like, that's ridiculous. All right. So we're going to get into the book, The Future in Perspective, page 1264, second paragraph down. In the days of Horatio Alger, the marks of a youthful middle-class aspiration were such obvious symbols as well-polished shoes, a necktie, and a suit coat, a clean-shaved face, and well-cut hair, and punctuality. For almost a generation now, teen culture has rejected the necktie and suit coat. Well-polished shoes gave way to dirty saddle shoes, and these in turn to loafers and thong sandals. Shaving became irregular, especially when schools were not in session. Haircuts were postponed endlessly, with much parental adolescent bickering. Fewer and fewer young people carried watches, even when they lived, as on college campuses, in fairly scheduled lives. Dating, as part of adolescent rebellion, became less and less formalized. The formal middle class dance of a generation ago, arranged weeks ahead and with a dance program, became almost obsolete. Everything has to be totally casual, or today's youth rejects it. By 1947, a dance program listing the dances in numbered order with the girl's partner for each written down was obsolete. Going steady, which meant dancing only with the boy who invited her, became established, a complete rejection of the middle-class dance whose purpose was to provide the girl with a maximum number of different partners in order to widen her acquaintance with matrimonial possibilities. Going steady, much of adolescent culture of the jive era, was derived from the gangster circles of South Chicago and was first introduced to middle-class knowledge through George Raft movies of the 1930s. It was satirized in a now forgotten popular song of the 1920s called I Want to Dance with the Guy What Brung Me. But by 1947, it was the way of life of much of adolescent America. As a consequence, teenage couples at high school dances sat out most of the evening in bored silence or chatted in a delus, uh, des, des, desultory fashion, with friends of the same sex. The jive, language of the period, also had a South Chicago origin and had been traced back to a large extent to a saloon run by a certain local oracle called Hep early in the 20th century. Fortunately, going steady was only a brief, if drastic, challenge to parental attitudes and was soon replaced by tribal gregariousness and tolerant sexual broad-mindedness, which might be called clique going, since it involved social solidarity, sometimes sexual promiscuity, within a small group, usually of 10 or less. This became, to their adults, the teenage gang, which still thrives, but never in a very formal way in middle-class circles as it does in lower-class ones. Two casualties of this process are sexual jealousy and sexual privacy, both of which have largely disappeared among many middle-class young people. In some group, sex has become a purely physiological act, somewhat like eating or sleeping. In others, sexual experience is restricted to loved ones, but since these youths love many persons, or even love everyone, this is much less of a restriction than it might seem to a middle-class mind. Generally, a sharp distinction is made between loving someone, which justifies sex, and being in love with someone, which justifies monogamous behavior. But there is a widespread tolerance and endless discussion of all these issues. This discussion, like most of the adolescent's endless talk, never reaches any decision but leaves the question open or decides that it all depends on how you look at it. Subjectivism. As part of such discussions, there is complete casual frankness as to who has had or is having sexual experiences with whom. Widely permeated with an existentialist outlook, the adolescent society regards each sexual experience as an isolated, contextless act with no necessary cause or consequence except the momentary merging of two lonelinesses in an act of togetherness. So basically, pump and dump was already in effect in like 1947. Among middle class youth, it is accompanied by an atmosphere of compassion or pity rather than of passion or even love, the way Holden Caulfield might experience sex. Among lower class persons, it is much more likely to be a physiologically inspired and associated with passion or roughness. This often attracts middle class girls who become dissatisfied with the weakness and undersexuality of middle class boys. We're going to put a post it note in there because you can see this is what happens. You make the guys soft, then the women want to go with evil guys. Answering my question from before, why aren't the girls going with the guys in their grade? Why are they looking for 80-year-old guys to have sex with on a private island? Because they feel like the guys in their class are weak and undersexualized because their mothers browbeat them into becoming basically like simps. But petty bourgeois youth, as befits the final defenders of middle class conventionality and hypocrisy, still tend to approach sex with secrecy and even guilt. Because of the breakdown of communication between the generations of middle class families, parents know little of this side of teenage culture, at least so far as their own children are concerned. They usually know much more about the behavior of their friends' children because they are more likely to catch glimpses of the behavior of the latter in unguarded moments. On the whole, middle class parents today are surprisingly and secretly tolerant about the behaviors of their daughters so long as they do not create a public scandal by getting into trouble. Mothers usually feel that their sons are too young and should wait for sexual experience, while fathers sometimes secretly think it might do their son's immaturity some good. When middle class children get into trouble or any kind of scrape, their only large anxiety is to prevent their parents from finding out. Petty bourgeois parents, as the last defense of middle class conventionality, generally disapprove of any illicit sexual experiences by any of their children. Naturally, there are great variations in all these things, with religion as the chief varying factor and variety of local customs in secondary significance. However, even in religious circles, the behavior of the young is not at all what their adults expect or believe. For example, the number of Roman Catholic young people who have premarital or even casual sexual experiences is much larger than the number who are willing to eat meat on Friday. Damn. One reason for the spreading of these relaxed ideas on behavior is the devastating honesty of the younger generation, especially about themselves. This seems to be based on their gregarious garrulity. Really? Garrulity? Okay. An earlier generation had its share of illicit actions of all kinds, but they kept these a secret and regarded each as an aberrant action that was psychologically excluded from their accepted social patterns and would not, therefore, be repeated. This view continued no matter how often it was repeated. But the younger generation of today has accepted the existentialist idea I am what I do. The adolescent tells his group what he did, and they usually agree that this is the way he is, however surprising it is. Their whole attitude is pragmatic, almost experimental. This is what happened. This is the way things are. This is the way I am. They are engaged in a search for themselves as individuals, something they were called upon to do in the early grades of school, thanks to the misconceptions of John Dewey, and they are quite alien to any theory that the self is a creature of trained patterns and is not a creature of discovered secrets. Now, in the 1960s, this opinion of man's nature is changing, and as a consequence of George Orwell's mishmash conceptions of brainwashing and the revival of Pavlovian psychology through the work of men like Professor B.F. Skinner of Harvard, the idea of personality as something trained under discipline to a desired pattern is being revived. With this revival of a basically puritanical idea of human nature reappears the usual Puritan errors on the nature of evil and acceptance of the theory of the evil of human nature as preached in William Golding's Lord of the Flies. The new outlook emerging from all this is a complex, tentative, and full of inconsistencies, but it will surely play an increasing role in our history as the younger generation grows older, abandoning many of the ideas they now hold with increasing responsibility, but at the same time, the new outlook will force very great modifications in the American point of view as a whole. This new outlook of the rising generation of middle class has a negative and a positive side. Its negative side can be seen in its large-scale unconcern for the basic values of the middle class outlook. Its rejection of self-discipline, of future preference, of infinitely expandable material living standards, and of material symbols of middle class status. In general, this negative attitude appears in many of the activities we have described, and above all in a profound rejection of abstractions, slogans, cliches, and conventions. These are treated with tolerant irony tinged with contempt. The targets of these attitudes are the general values of the petty bourgeois and of the middle class parents, position in society, what people think, self-respect, keeping up with the Joneses, the American way of life, virtue, making money, destroying our country's enemies, virginity, respect for the established organizations, including their elders, the clergy, political leaders, or big businessmen, and such. The shift from a destructive or negative to a positive view of the new American outlook is, to some extent, chronological. It may be seen in the former popularity of Elvis Presley and the newer enthusiasm for Joan Baez or folk singers generally. There is also a social distinction here to some extent, as Elvis remains, to a fair degree, popular with the lower classes, while Joan is a middle class or even college level favorite. But the contrast in outlook between the two is what is significant. Joan is gentle, compassionate, empathetic, totally honest, concerned about people as individuals, free of pretenses, singing quietly in a simple dress and bare feet, full of love and fundamental human decency, and committed to these. The rejection of acquiescentiveness and even of sensuality may be seen in the change in tastes in movies, especially in the popularity of foreign films directed by men like Ingmar Bergman and Federico Fellini. The latter's La Dolce Vita in 1961, a smash hit in the United States, was a portrayal of the meaningless disillusionment of material success and of sensuality in contrast with the power and mystery of nature, symbolized by a giant fish pulled from the sea and left to die by thoughtless men, and the direct honesty and innocence of a child watching the scene. This rejection of material things and of sensuality is, in some strange way, leading the younger generation to some kind of increased spirituality. Property and food mean very little to them. They share almost everything, give to others when they have very little for themselves, expect reciprocal sharing but not repayment, and feel free to borrow in this way without permission. 3 meals a day is out. In fact, meals are almost out. They eat very little and irregularly, in sharp contrast to the middle classes in the century who overate, as many mature middle class persons still do. The petty bourgeois and lower classes still tend to overeat or to be neurotic snackers, but middle class youth is almost monastic in its eating. Food is just not important unless it is an occasion for a crowd to gather. Much of this decrease in emphasis on food is a consequence of the rejection of the discipline of time. Everything in their lives is irregular, including their natural bodily processes. They usually get up too late to eat breakfast, snack somewhere along the day, refuse to carry watches, and often have no idea what day of the week it is. This new outlook is basically existentialist in its emphasis on direct momentary personal experience, especially with other people. It emphasizes people and finds the highest good of life in interpersonal relations, handled generally with compassion and irony. The two chief concerns of life are caring and helping. Caring, which they usually call love, means a general acceptance of the fact that people matter and are subjects of concern. This love is diffuse and quite often impersonal, not aimed at a particular individual or friend, but at anyone, at persons in general, and especially at persons one does not know at all. As an act of recognition, almost of expiation, that we are all helpless children together. The whole idea is very close to Christ's message, love one another, and has given rise to the younger generation's passionate concern with remote peoples, the American Negroes, and the outcast poor. It is reflected in the tremendous enthusiasm among the young for the Peace Corps, civil rights and racial equality, and the attack on poverty, all of which have much greater support among middle-class young people than can be measured even by the surprisingly large numbers who actively do something. This desire to do something is what I call helping. It is a strange and largely symbolic kind of helping, since there is with it a fairly widespread feeling that nothing that the helper can do will make any notable dent in the colossal problem. Nonetheless, there is an obligation to do something, not only as a symbolic act, but also as an almost masochistic rejection of the middle class past. This is definitely like the left wing Antifa type people. The younger generation who support the Peace Corps, the attack on poverty, and the drive for Negro rights have an almost irresistible compulsion to do these things as a demonstration of their rejection of their parents' value system and as some restitution for the adults' neglect of these urgent problems. But the real motivation behind the urge to help is closely related with the urge to care. It consists simply of a desire to show another human being that he is not alone. There is little concern for human perfectibility or social progress such as accompanied middle-class humanitarianism in the 19th century. Both of these urges are existentialist. They give rise to isolated acts that have no significant context. Thus, an act of loving or helping has no sequence of causes leading up to it or of consequences flowing from it. It stands alone as an isolated experience of togetherness and of brief human sharing. This failure or lack of context for each experience means a failure or lack of meaning, for meaning and significance arise from context, that is, from the relationship of the particular experience to the whole picture. But today's youth has no concern for the whole picture. They have rejected the past and have very little faith in the future. Their rejection of intellect and their lack of faith in human reason gives them no hope that any meaning can be found for any experience. So each experience becomes an end in itself, isolated from every other experience. This skepticism about meaning, closely allied with their rejection of organizations and of abstractions, is so closely related with a failure of responsibility. Since consequences are divorced from the act or experience itself, the youth is not bound by any relationship between the two. The result is large-scale irresponsibility. If a young person makes an appointment, he may or may not keep it. He may come very late or not at all. In any case, he feels no shame at failure to carry out what he said he would do. In fact, the young people of today constantly speak of what they are going to do after lunch, tonight, tomorrow, next week, but they rarely do what they say. To them, it was always very tentative, a hope rather than a statement, and binding on no one. If the young fail to do what they say, they are neither embarrassed nor apologetic and hardly think it necessary to explain or even mention it. Their basic position is that everyone concerned had the same freedom to come or not, and if you showed up while they did not, this does not give you any right to complain because you also had the same right to stay away as they had. The other great weakness of the younger generation is their lack of self-discipline. They are as episodic as in their interests and ambitions as they are in their actions. Maybe because TV is episodic, maybe that's why people start to think episodically, because, TV programming. They can almost kill themselves with overwork for something that catches their fancy, usually something associated with their group or with caring or helping. Oh, they can kill themselves? You mean like the people protesting ICE? But in general, they have little tenacity of application or self-discipline in action. They lack imagination also, an almost inevitable consequence of an outlook that concentrates on experiences without context. Their experiences are necessarily limited and personal and are never fitted into a larger picture or linked with the past or the future. As a result, they find it almost impossible to picture anything different from what it is, or even to see what it is from any long-range perspective. This means that their outlooks, in spite of their wide exposure to different situations through the mass media or by personal travel, are very narrow. They lack the desire to obtain experience vicariously from reading, and the vicarious experience they get from talk, usually with their fellows, are rarely much different from their own experiences. As a result, their lives, while erratic, are strangely dull and homogeneous. Even their sexual experiences are routine, and any efforts to escape this by experimenting with homosexuality, alcohol, drugs, extra-racial partners, or other unnecessary fringe accessories generally leave it dull and routine. Efforts by middle-class parents to prevent their children from developing along these non-middle-class lines are generally futile. An effort to use parental discipline to enforce conformity to middle-class values or behaviors means the child will quote all the many cases in the neighborhood where the children are not being disciplined. He is encouraged in his resistance to parental discipline by its large scale failure all around him. Moreover, if his parents insist on conformity, he has an invincible weapon to use against them: academic failure. This weapon is used by boys rather than girls, partly because it is a weapon for the weak and involves doing nothing rather than doing something, but also because the school seems to most middle class boys an alien place and an essential element in their general adolescent feelings of homelessness. Girls who are pressured by their parents to conform resist by sexual delinquencies more often than boys, and in extreme cases get pregnant or have sexual experiences with Negro boys. From this whole context of adolescent resistance to parental pressures to conform to middle class behavior flows a major portion of middle class adolescent delinquency, which is quite distinct in its origins from the delinquency of the lowest outcast class in the slums. It involves all kinds of activities, from the earliest efforts to smoke or drink, through speeding, car stealing, and vandalism of property, to major crimes and perversions. It is quite different in origin and usually in character from the delinquencies of the uprooted, which are either crimes for personal benefit, such as thievery and mugging, or crimes of social resentment, such as slashing tires and convertible tops or smashing school windows. Some activities, of course, such as automobile stealing, appear among both. These remarks, it must be emphasized, apply to the middle class and are not intended to apply to the other classes in American society. The aristocrats, for example, have considerable success in passing along their outlook to their children, partly because it is presented as a class or family attitude and not as a parental or personal attitude, partly because their friends and close associates are also aristocrats or semi-aristocrats, and rejection of their point of view tends to leave an aristocratic adolescent much more personally isolated than rejection of his parents' view leaves a middle-class adolescent. Indeed, the latter finds group togetherness only if he does reject his parents, partly because there is much more segregation of the sexes among the aristocrats than the middle classes, but chiefly because the aristocrats use a separate school system, including disciplined boarding schools. The use of the latter, the key to long persistence of the aristocratic tradition in England, makes it possible for outsiders to discipline adolescents without disrupting the family. Among the middle class, efforts to discipline adolescents is largely in the hands of parents, but the effort to do so tends to disrupt the family by setting husband against wife and children against parents. As a result, discipline is usually held back to retain at least the semblance of family solidarity as viewed from the outside world, which is really what counts with middle class people. But the aristocratic private boarding schools, modeled on those of England, in accord with the basic Anglophilism of the American aristocracy, is sexually segregated from females, tough, sports oriented, usually high Episcopal, almost Anglican, and disciplines its charges with the importance of the group, their duty to the group, and the painfulness of the ultimate punishment, which is alienation from the group. So we can see the upper classes, they're sending their kids to boys only schools, like I was saying before, right? And then they're learning how to work as a group, like I said before. As a consequence of this, any resentment the aristocratic adolescent may have is aimed at his masters, not at his home and parents, and home comes to represent a relatively desirable place to which he is admitted occasionally as a reward for long weeks on the firing line at school. Such a boy is removed from the smothering influence of momism, grows up relatively shy of girls, has more than his share of homosexual experiences to which he may succumb completely, but on the whole, usually grows up to be a very energetic, constructive, stable, and self sacrificing citizen prepared to inflict the same training processes on his own sons. Unfortunately for the aristocrat who wishes to expose his son to the same training process as that which molded his own outlook, he finds this difficult thing to do because the organizations that helped form him outside the family, the Episcopal Church, or its local equivalent, the boarding school, the Ivy League university, and the once sheltered summer resort, have all changed and are being invaded by a large number of non aristocratic intruders who change the atmosphere of the whole place. This change in atmosphere is hard to define to anyone who has not experienced it personally. Fundamentally, it is a distinction between playing the game and playing to win. The aristocrat plays for the sake of the game, or the team, or the school. He plays whether he is much good or not, because he feels that he is contributing to a community effort, even if he is on the scrubs rather than a star or starting player. The newer recruits to former aristocratic educational institutions play for more personal reasons, with much greater intensity, even fanaticism, and play to excel and to distinguish themselves from others. Basically, old money versus new money. One reason for the accessibility of formerly aristocratic organizations to people of a non aristocratic origin has already been noted, but probably was discounted by the reader. That is my statement that the American establishment, which is so aristocratic and Anglophile in its foundation, came to accept the liberal ideology. The Episcopal Church, exclusive boarding schools, and Ivy League universities like Eton and Oxford decided that they must open their door to the more able of the non aristocratic classes. Accordingly, they established scholarships, recruited for these in lower schools they had never thought of before, and made efforts to have their admissions requirements and examinations fit the past experiences of non aristocratic applicants. By the end of the 1920s, Phillips Exeter Academy was welcoming on scholarship the sons of laboring immigrants with polysyllabic names, and by the 1950s, Episcopal clergymen were making calls on likely looking Negro families. As a consequence of this, the sons of aristocrats found themselves being squeezed out of the formative institutions that they had previously trained their fathers, and at the same time discovered that these institutions were themselves changing their character and becoming dominated by petty bourgeois rather than by aristocratic values. At the alumni reunion of June 1964, the president of Harvard was asked in an open forum what the questioner should do with his son, recently rejected for admission to Harvard, in spite of the fact that the son was descended from the Mayflower voyagers by 11 consecutive generations of Harvard men. To this tragic question, President Pusey replied, "I don't know what we can do about your son. We can't send him back because the Mayflower isn't running anymore." Despite this facetious retort, which may have been called forth by the inebriate condition of the questioner, the fact remains that the aristocratic outlook has had a great deal to contribute to any organization fortunate enough to share it. Among other things, it had kept Harvard, where aristocratic control continued almost to the present day, at the top or close to the top of the American educational hierarchy decade after decade. The sincere effort by aristocrats and Democrat alike to make the social ladder in America a ladder of opportunity rather than a ladder of privilege has opened the way to a surge of petty bourgeois recruits over the faltering bodies of the disintegrating middle class. The petty bourgeois are rising in American society along the channels established in the great American hierarchies of business, the armed forces, academic life, the professions, finance, and politics. They are doing this not because they have imagination, broad vision, judgment, moderation, versatility, or group loyalties, but because they have neurotic drives of personal ambition and competitiveness, great insecurities and resentments, narrow specialization, and fanatical application to the task before each of them. Their fathers earning $100 a week as bank clerks or insurance agents were unionized bricklayers were getting $120 a week when they cared to work, embraced the middle class ideology with tenacity as the chief means, along with their white collared clothing, of distinguishing themselves from the unionized labor they feared or hated. Their wives, whom they had married because they held the same outlook, looked forward eagerly to seeing their sons become the kind of material success the father had failed to reach. The family accepted a common outlook that believed specialization and hard work, either in business or in a profession, would win this material success. The steps up that ladder of success were clearly marked: to be the outstanding boy student and graduate in school, to win entrance to and graduation from the best university possible, naturally an Ivy League one, and then the final years of specialized application in a professional school. Many of these eager workers headed for medicine because to them, medicine, despite the 10 years of necessary preparation, meant up to $40,000 a year income by age 50. As a consequence, the medical profession in the United States ceased very largely to be a profession of fatherly confessors and unprofessing humanitarians and become one of the largest groups of hard-headed petty bourgeois hustlers in the United States, and their professional association became the most ruthlessly materialistic lobbying association of any professional group. So that's what happened to medicine. I've been saying this for years, that the doctors, people should become doctors because they want to heal people, not because they want to be rich. And that's the problem. They don't care about people. They're not the same type of doctors that people used to be, where people used to become doctors because they wanted to help people. Now people are like, well, which job pays the most? Oh, lawyer, doctor. Oh, I'll be a lawyer or doctor. They don't care about the law. They don't care about healing people. And it's obviously clear. And that's why they just keep raising the price. They're like, oh, you're sick? Guess what? We're going to raise the price of your treatment. We're going to raise the price of this. We're going to raise the price because that's all they care about. Because they're come from this group of people that was just the up and coming group of people that were mad that there was rich people. And then they were like, okay, well, we're going to become rich. We're going to take over all their rich people stuff. Similar persons with lesser opportunities were shunted off the more advantageous rungs of the ladder into second best schools and third rate universities. All flocked into the professions, even to teaching, which, on the face of it, might have expected that its practitioners would have some allegiance to the truth and to helping the young to realize their less materialistic potentialities, where they quickly abandoned the classroom for the more remunerative tasks of educational administration. And, of course, the great mass of these eager beavers went into science or business, preferably into the largest corporations, where they looked with fish-eyed anticipation at those rich, if remote, plums of vice presidencies in General Motors, Ford, General Dynamics, or international business machines. Right? And then you can see now women are doing the same thing, right? First, it was like the kind of like lower middle class were like demanding that they become CEOs, even though the established people that created it were basically the people that were like the first people that came to the United States, or the descendants of the first people that basically got the land for free by just walking over to some place and be like, this is my land now. I'm building a fence around it. I don't have to pay any money, right? Then the second group of people was this group of people, which is like the lower middle class that were smart enough to move up into the upper class, right? And now it's women. Now women are demanding that they become, the vice president of General Motors, Ford, General Dynamics, and IBM, right? The success of these petty bourgeois recruits in America's organizational structure rested on their ability to adapt their lives to the screening process the middle classes had set up, covering access to the middle class organizational structures. The petty bourgeois, as the last fanatical defenders of the middle class outlook, had, in excess degree, the qualities of self-discipline and future preference the middle classes had established as the unstated assumptions behind their screens of aptitude testing, intelligence evaluation, motivational research, and potential success measurements. Above all, the American public school system, permeated with the unstated assumptions of the middle class values, was ideally suited to demonstrate petty bourgeois success quotients. These successive barriers in the middle class screening process were almost insurmountable to the working class, and the outcast became very difficult to the new generation of middle class children who rejected their parents' value system but were ideally adapted to the petty bourgeois anxiety neurosis. By 1960, however, big business, government civil service, and the Ivy League university were becoming disillusioned with these petty bourgeois recruits. The difficulty was that these new recruits were rigid, unimaginative, narrow, and above all, illiberal at a time when liberalism, in the sense of reaching tentative and approximate decision through flexible community interaction, was coming to be regarded as the proper approach to large organization problems. In his farewell report, the chairman of Harvard's admission committee, Wilbur Bender, summed up the problem this way. The student who ranks first in his class may be genuinely brilliant, or he may be a compulsive worker, or the instrument of domineering parents' ambition, or a conformist or a self-centered careerist who has shrewdly calculated his teacher's prejudices and expectations and discovered how to regurgitate efficiently what they want. Or he may have focused narrowly on grade getting as compensation for his inadequacies in other areas, because he lacks other interests or talents, or lacks passion and warmth or normal healthy instincts, or is afraid of life. The top high school student is often, frankly, a pretty dull and bloodyless or peculiar fellow. Wait, so what is he saying? The top high school student is often, frankly, a pretty dull and bloodless or peculiar fellow. The adolescent with wide-ranging curiosity and stubborn independence, with a vivid imagination and desire to explore fascinating bypaths, to follow his own interests, to contemplate, to read the unrequired books. The boy with sheer love of life and exuberance may well seem to his teacher troublesome, undisciplined, a rebel, may not conform to their stereotype, and may not get the top grades and the highest rank in class. He may not even score the highest level in the standard multiple choice admissions test, which may well reward the glib, facile mind at the expense of the questioning, independent, or slower, but more powerful and subtle, and more interesting and original mind. So basically, test filter out for boring people. The S, basically getting a highest grade on the SAT, means that you're boring and unimaginative. Or you just copy what the teacher wants, or you could be smart. These remarks bring us closer to one of the major problems in American culture today. We need a culture that will produce people eager to do things, but we need even more a culture that will make it possible to decide what to do. This is the old vision of means and goals. Decisions about goals require values, meaning, context, and perspective, all of which existentialism cannot provide. Subjectivism cannot provide goals, value, meaning, context, or perspective. Right? Utilitarianism can't provide these things. Liberalism can't provide these things. They can be set, even tentatively and approximately, only by people who have some inkling of the whole picture. The middle-class culture of our past ignored the whole picture and destroyed our ability to see it by its emphasis on specialization. Just as mass production came to be based on specialization, so human preparation for making decisions about goals also became based on specialization. The free elective system in higher education was associated with choice of a major field of specialization, and all the talk about liberal arts, outside electives, general education, or required distribution were largely futile. They were futile because no general view of the whole picture could be made simply by attaching together a number of specialist views or narrow fields, for the simple reason that each specialist field looks entirely different, presenting different problems and requiring different techniques when it is placed in a general picture. This is what a lot of these like scientist people don't understand, where they're like, oh, we don't need to do philosophy anymore. We know how things work. We know how things work now. So we don't need to tell you why they're doing it. We just know, we can just tell you how they're doing it. Yeah, but that doesn't tell you what the goal is, what the value is. You're just repeating, basically, you're like, water drips down the faucet. And then you're like looking really close and you're like, well, the molecules inside the water cause the water to drip. We already know that. We already know that water drips down the faucet. But why? Oh, is it because the faucet's still on? Is it because you have a leaky faucet? And then it's like, well, why shouldn't you have a leaky faucet? Oh, because it wastes water. What's wrong with wasting water? Oh, it's because other people need the water. You see, it's like, but if you're just like, oh, well, I could just tell you how molecules drip down. It's like, that's science. It doesn't give you a full picture of what's actually happening. And that's why people are going into all this stuff where it's like people know so much about their specialized field, but they can't tell you how it relates to the other stuff. How does science relate to politics? How does science relate to geopolitics? How does science relate to human relationships, right? Psychology? No, they could just tell you, oh, it's a molecule, and we can look inside the molecule and see atoms. Well, that's how it works. We can tell you exactly where the molecule will be at this specific time of day. Okay, but what does that mean about why we should be using the molecules in any way, shape, or form? It doesn't. The simple fact still has been not real. This simple fact still has not been realized in those circles that talk most about broadening outlooks. This was clearly shown in the influential Harvard Report on General Education in 1945. As one reviewer of this document said, it cost $40,000 to produce, and a better answer could have been found by buying one of the books of Sir Richard Livingstone for $2.75. This remark is equally mistaken on the opposite side, a fact that shows that the solution can be found only by all parties freeing themselves from the preconceptions by getting as familiar as possible with the diverse special areas in a skeptical way. Means are almost as difficult as ends. In fact, personal responsibility, self-discipline, some sense of time value and future preference, and above all, an ability to distinguish What is important from what is merely necessary must be found simply as a valuable attribute simply as valuable attributes of human beings as human beings. Neither America nor the world can be saved by a wholesale recreation of African social realities here in consequence of our rejection of the middle class outlook that brought us this far. Here we must discriminate. We have an achieving society because we have an achieving outlook in our excuse me because we have an achieving outlook in our society. And that achieving outlook has been, over the last few centuries, the middle class outlook. But there are other achieving outlooks. An achieving society could be constructed on the aristocratic outlook, on the scientific outlook, pursuit of the truth, on a religious basis, and probably on a large number of other outlooks. There is no need to go back to the middle class outlook, which really killed itself by successfully achieving what it set out to do. But parts of it we need, and above all, we need an achieving outlook. It might be pleasant just to give up, live in the present, enjoying existential personal experiences, living like lotus eaters from our amazing productive system, without personal responsibility, self discipline, or thought of the future. But this is impossible because the productive system would itself collapse and our external enemies would soon destroy us. We must have an achieving society and an achieving outlook. These will inevitably contain parts of the middle class outlook, but these parts will unquestionably be fitted together to serve quite different purposes. Future preference and self discipline were originally necessary in our society so that people would restrict consumption and accumulate savings that could be spent to provide investment in capital equipment. Now we no longer need these qualities for this purpose, since flows of income in our economy provide these on an institutional basis, but we still need these qualities so that young people will be willing to undergo the years of hard work and training that will prepare them to work in our complex technological society. We must get away from the older, crass materialism and egocentric, selfish individualism and pick up some of the younger generation's concern for the community and their fellow men. The unconventionality of this younger group may make them more able to provide the new outlook and innovation every society requires, but they cannot do this if they lack imagination or perspective. Above all, we must bring meaning back into human experience. This, like establishing and achieving outlook, can be done by going backwards in our Western tradition to the period before we had any bourgeois outlook. For our society had both meaning and purpose long before it had any middle class. Indeed, these are intrinsic elements in our society. In fact, the middle class outlook obtained its meaning and purpose from the society where it grew up. It did not give meaning or purpose to the society. And capitalism, along with the middle class outlook, became meaningless and purposeless when it so absorbed men's time and energies that men lost touch with the meaning and purpose of the society in which capitalism was a brief and partial aspect. But as a consequence of the influence of capitalism and of the middle classes, the tradition was broken, and the link between the meaning and purpose of our society, as it was before the middle class revolution, is no longer connected with the search for meaning and purpose by the new post middle class generation. This can be seen even in those groups like the Christian clergy who insisted that they were still clinging to the basic Christian tradition of our society. They were doing no such thing, but instead they were usually offering us meaningless verbiage or unrealistic abstractions that had little to do with our desire to experience and live in a Christian way here and now. Unfortunately, very few people, Even highly regarded experts on the subject have any very clear idea of what is the tradition of the West or how it is based on the fundamental need of Western civilization to reconcile its intellectual outlook with the basic facts of the Christian experience. The reality of the world, time, and the flesh forced bit by bit abandonment of the Greek rationalistic dualism as in Plato that opposed spirit and matter and made knowledge exclusively a concern of the former, achieved by internal illumination. This point of view that gave final absolute knowledge and thus justified despotism was replaced in the period 11,000 to 1350 by the medieval point of view that derived knowledge from the tentative and partial information obtained through sensual experience, from which man derived conceptual universals that fitted the real individual cases encountered in human experience only approximately. Aquinas, who said, "Nothing exists in the intelligence which was not first present in the senses," also said, "We cannot shift from the ideal to the actual." On this epistemological basis was established the root foundations of both modern science and modern liberalism, with a very considerable boost to both from the Franciscan nominalists of the century following Aquinas. The classical world had constantly fallen into intellectual error because it never solved the epistemological problem of the relationship between the theories and concepts in men's minds and the individual objects of sensual experience. The medieval period made a detailed examination of the problem, but its answer was ignored when post-Renaissance thinkers broke the tradition in philosophy because they felt it necessary to break the tradition in religion. From Descartes onward, this epistemological problem was ignored or considered in a childish way, as if the medieval thinkers had never examined it. Today it remains the great philosophic problem of our age. Irrational activism, semanticism, and existentialism flourish because the present century has no answer to the epistemological problem. In fact, most contemporary thinkers do not even recognize that there is a problem. Yeah, gotta put a post-it note on that. All these new atheists, man. They're like, oh, we don't need epistemology anymore, man. That's like some old like 19th, 18th century stuff where they were talking about what is truth and does God exist or not and all that other stuff. And we solved that problem. We already solved that problem. God doesn't exist. It's like, I don't think you did. But Bergson's rejection of intelligence and his advocacy of intuition was based, like the irrational activism once it sprang, on recognition of the fact that the space-time continuum in which man generally operates is non-rational. The whole existential movement was based on the same idea. Semanticism tried to solve the problem in a similar fashion by bringing the infinitely varied and dynamic quality of actuality into the human mind by insisting that the meaning of each word must follow the dynamics of the word by changing every time it is used. All these movements tried to reject logic and rationality from human thinking process because they are not found in space-time actuality. But the tradition of the West, as clearly established in Christian religion and in medieval philosophy, was that man must use rationality to the degree it is possible in handling a universe whose ultimate nature is well beyond man's present rational capacity to grasp. This is the conclusion that the success of the West in World War II forces the West and the world to recognize once again. And in recognizing it, we must return to the tradition so carelessly discarded in the 15th century, which had shown the relationship between thought and action. Alfred Korzybski argued in Science and Sanity that mental health depended on successful action and that successful action depended on adequate relation between the irrational nature of the objective world and the vision of the world that the actor has subjectively in his head. Korzybski Korzybski's solution, like most other thinkers over the last two generations, has been to bring the irrationality of the world into man's thinking process. This solution of the problem is now bankrupt, totally destroyed at Hiroshima and Berlin in 1945. The alternate solution lies in the tradition of the West. It must be found, and the link with our past must be restored so that the tradition may resume the process of growth that was interrupted so long ago. Korzybski, Bergson, and the rest of them are quite correct. Most of man's experience takes place in an irrational actuality of space time. But we now know that man must deal with his experience through subjective processes that are both rational and logical, using rules of thought explicitly understood by all concerned, and that the necessary adjustments between the conclusions reached by thought and the confused irrationalities of experience must be made in the process of shifting from thought to action and not in the thinking process itself. Only thus will the West achieve successful thought, successful actions, and the sanity that is the link between these two. As a result of this rupture of tradition, the thinkers of today are fumbling in an effort to find a meaning that will satisfy them. This is as true of the contemporary babbling philosophers as it is of the younger generations who fumblingly try to express Christ's message of love and help without any apparent realization that Christ's message is available in writing and that generations of thinkers debated its implications centuries ago. The meaning the present generation is seeking can be found in our own past. Part of it, concerned with loving and helping, can be found in Christ by going back to the age before his message was overwhelmed in ritualism and bureaucracy. Part of it can be found in the basic philosophic outlook of the West as seen in medieval philosophy and the scientific method that grew out of it. The problem of meaning today is the problem of how the diverse and superficially self-contradictory experiences of men can be put into a consistent picture that will provide contemporary man with a convincing basis from which to live and to act. This can be achieved only by a hierarchy that distinguishes what is necessary from what is important, as the medieval outlook did. But any modern explanation based on hierarchy must accept dynamicism as an all-pervasive element in the system, as the medieval hierarchy so signally failed to do. The effort of Teilhard de Chardin to do this has won enormous interest in recent years, but its impact has been much blunted by the fact that his presentation contained in reciprocal relationship a deficiency of courage and a surplus of deliberate ambiguity. However, the real problem does not rest so much in theory as in practice. The real value of any society rests in its ability to develop mature and responsible individuals prepared to stand on their own feet, make decisions, and be prepared to accept the consequences of their decisions and actions without whining or self-justification. This was the ideal that the Christian tradition established long ago, and in consequence of its existence, our Western society, whatever its deficiencies, has done better than any other society that has ever existed. If it has done less well recently than earlier in its career, a disputable point of view, This weakness can be remedied only by some reform in its methods of child rearing that will increase its supply of mature and responsible adults. Once this process has been established, the adults thus produced can be relied upon to adopt from our Western heritage of the past a modified ideology that will fit the needs of the present as well as the traditions of the past. And if Western culture can do that, either in America or in Europe, it need fear no enemies from within or from without. Okay, well, a big part of that tradition was having fathers in the home protecting their family, which we don't have anymore. So it doesn't seem like we're going back to that. All right. The next chapter is going to be European ambiguities. That's going to be on page 1279. Get into that tomorrow, hopefully. Hopefully, getting close to the end now. Getting there. All right. He kind of went through the whole like middle class thing, and we can see that that's kind of like where the left is at right now, where it's like they're on the like helping people and caring about people, especially distant people thing, as a rejection of the parents' values, because basically what he was saying is that since the middle class parents have to discipline their children start to resent them because other people's parents in the neighborhood are more permissive, allowing them to do other stuff. And then the parents basically lose control of the children because the children form a peer group where they basically all reject all of their parents' discipline at once, giving them like some type of solidarity, basically in the fact that they're all rejecting their parents' values. And then the upper classes still send their kids to non-co-ed boarding schools where they're basically trained in like a military type fashion to work together, cooperate together. And of course, he's not really saying it, but there's much more to lose, right? If you're like coming from like a lower middle class family, that these families have basically rejected inheritance, which is a communist idea, rejecting inheritance, rejecting helping your family, like the whole like kicking you out of the house when you're 18. That's communism basically, because the tradition of the West was to have inheritance to pass down to your kids, right? And the aristocratic families, they still have that. They still have that. So they still have that thing that makes their children want to actually be in the family. And they outsource the discipline to the boarding school so that the kids are more likely to hate the outside world and love their family. Where in the middle class, people hate their family and love the outside world because their parents have to directly discipline them because they don't get discipline in the schools, and the other people in the neighborhood can't discipline the kids or don't even want to because they're just as liberal or more liberal than your parents, right? And then we can see that they pretty much lost control over women. They stopped doing chaperone dates. The kids are just hanging out. They're supposed to go to these supervised dances. They're like not going to that. They're just hooking up, basically hookup culture, pump and dumps. That was going on in the 50s. Like nothing has changed basically, really, except it's just gotten more drastic and more dramatic to the point where now, like, you got these like liberal white people that are about to commit suicide for a Somali immigrant that doesn't even know that they're there, doesn't even care, right? And so we can see that what he's talking about kind of the philosophical breakdown with all this existentialism and people being like, the only truth is there is no truth, blah, 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 relativism, moral relativism, right? Which is just on its face retarded because you think people are playing a word game when you say the only truth is there's no, you're making a statement that's a freaking what's it called? Contradiction, complete contradiction. And that's like one of the basic laws of logic that the entire society was built on. And like they're saying, okay, well, if we can't get out of this stupid like mind body dualism thing, we still have to think as though logic is real. We still have to put God as the like central point of logic, so that we can still think in the basic structure that the society was basically built off of. That's the way that everybody thought. Since everyone's saying that Western society is the greatest society and all this other stuff, but you're throwing out the most basic concept that made Western society the best society, quote unquote, ever, was the thought process that led people to create the society, which was believing in God, believing in logic, believing in rationality, believing in objective truth, believing in goals and teleology and logos and all these other basic philosophical ideas that everyone wants to throw out now and say that you're stupid because look, I can tell you how a molecule works, so I don't need to know why a molecule. I just need to know how a molecule. I don't need to know why. I just need to know how. And if I can explain to you how in the most detailed way possible, that means I know, but you don't know, because you have to know why in order to know. You have to know whether or not there's an external world in order to know. If the way that existentialists exist, you literally could be like that brain in a vat thing. That's what the Matrix is talking about. It's like you're just a brain in a vat. Once you go into existentialism, there's no difference between you being a brain in a vat because everything is just a subjective experience, right? That's why all the girls on the Whatever podcast say, I'm a 10. I'm a 10. Because it's just a subjective experience. And then when you try to explain to them that there's an external world where men rate them on a scale of 1 to 10, they can't understand it. But then when you ask them to rate men on a scale from 1 to 10, they're like, oh, this guy's like a 3, this guy's a 2, this guy's a 1. So they could subjectively rate you, but then when it comes to rating them, then they're like, oh, I don't understand what's happening because it's like solipsism. They're like, I'm the only rational actor here. So I decide everything. I decide. And then because of the fact that they're getting simped on completely by men in society, they can believe that. Right? Because to them, the external world is responding in a way where they're getting everything they want. So they don't need to know objective truth. Right? And so we can see this mindset and people that are pushing this mindset of subjective morals, existentialism, all this type of stuff. Like, I completely reject that. And if you're still trying, oh, well, the only truth is that there is no truth, it's like, get out of my face, bro. Like, I don't want to hear it. You can see in the book that's part of one of the main reasons why society's falling apart. It's not because, oh, there's too many poor people, there's too many black people, there's too many Mexicans, the boomers are doing this, the politicians are doing this. It's because people literally can't think because they rejected the idea that God is logically necessary in order to think in a Western style. In order to think in English, you have to have that presuppositionary starting point that God is real and there is such thing as truth. And if you don't have that, then your society falls apart due to existentialism and self-actualization, whatever that even means. That to me doesn't make any sense. All right. Been going on for a little bit there now. Gonna end the video here. Thanks for watching if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.